Welcome to the Jay-Z Show. I'm Zafar Subhan from Dhaka, Bangladesh. John Danilowitz is joining us from, well, I don't know, an undisclosed location, or are you still outside of Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts?
Well, I'm physically in Massachusetts still, but in spirit of the holidays, I'm on Fifth Avenue, I guess, in New York City at the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So we celebrated Thanksgiving here in the United States yesterday. So we're
Yes.
all in that kind of turkey hangover, shopping bonanza, getting ready for the Christmas season.
I see a turkey of sorts behind your right shoulder. What am I looking at?
Yeah, that's one of the, I guess, the floats in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
Okay, excellent, super. Yes. Um, Now, on the subject of Thanksgiving, I'm not sure how people would look at this, but these have been, since we last spoke, these have been very news-rich times in Bangladesh. The big story, of course, is the conviction of Sheikh Hasina in the ICT of crimes against humanity and the death penalty, which was uh, meted out to her by the judges. What are your thoughts on that, John?
Yeah. So I took a couple days hiatus from social media to correspond with the holidays. And as I've come back, I was thinking today, what I'm thankful for. So I don't want to be, macabre and say that I'm thankful for the death sentences. But I am thankful to see that the accountability process is moving forward in Bangladesh. And this was long awaited. Again, the verdict, I don't think, was a surprise to anyone. And there's been a lot of commentary that's been written since about the verdict, the implications, critiques from the, I think, predictable, corners. But for me, really, what I've been thinking about and focusing on is the implication of the verdict for Hasina herself, for her co-accused, for her family, and for the Awami League as a party. So in some ways, again, we're entering this new phase of elections with, I guess, the declaration of the election schedule happening any time now. And I think it is significant that Sheikh Hasina is now not just accused of having committed crimes, but she has been convicted in multiple courts on multiple charges. Those verdicts and those processes can be subject to criticism. There could be retrials in the future, but nonetheless, I think it was a significant milestone.
Yeah, I mean, I have published a number of pieces across the spectrum of opinion in Counterpoint, which is my weekly newspaper. And it is, of course, a difficult subject to address because, on the one hand, you have someone who is almost certainly guilty of the crimes of which she is accused. At the same time, there are legitimate uh, criticisms and critiques which can be levied against the process. So it's a complicated issue to pass. I think I too lean into what you have said, that ultimately what this speaks to is two things. One is accountability. So I think it's very important that the message be sent that there will be accountability for crimes committed, high crimes committed while in office, which was never the case in the history of Bangladesh. Secondly, I think it is also important that the victims and their families receive some measure of justice, which is again something which is fairly unprecedented in the history of Bangladesh. Certainly, there are issues with the defense which Sheikh Hasina received, but at the same time, I also think it's important to contrast or compare this judicial process with the judicial process which was brought in the ICT earlier for the war crimes trials. And my understanding, talking to lawyers, talking to people who are very familiar with both sets of cases, is that the evidence presented in this case, this particular case, was far more persuasive than the evidence in the past. And in that sense, the judicial process holds greater water, perhaps, than some of the ICT trials in the past. I think the final point, which is important to raise, is that Hasina is not here. it's not as though this verdict is going to translate into her being executed, whereas, of course, in the past, a lot of these verdicts did translate into people being executed. So in that sense, the import is less, and I think it's important. In a way, it solves the problem. It sends the message without actually having to deliver what's the word I'm looking for? To actually carry out the verdict. So in that sense, she remains safe in Delhi, whereas the victims and their family also receive some measure of recompense, some measure of justice.
Right, and ultimately, if you look at the implications of this, it's hard for me sitting here in Massachusetts to judge what the reactions are on the ground in Bangladesh. But certainly, from what I've seen, it doesn't appear that there was a huge reaction from her previous supporters or current supporters, her party. There was some noise, some threats before the verdict, but not much has happened since. The
No,
verdict,
that's
though, I think,
absolutely right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and
No, that's
then
absolutely right. And we were worried about that. We were concerned, is there going to be unrest? And I think the whole nation really sort of breathed a sigh of relief that didn't appear to be the case. And again, that's something which is new. So we're hopeful. The whole point of all of this is we're trying to move into a new day here in Bangladesh. So that's the kind of idea. And the hope is that this is an integral part of that journey we're taking. In Bangladesh.
Right, and the other thing is that there's so much happening in Bangladesh. The other thing I monitor a lot is what's happening online, and certainly people online moved on to other issues that have come up in the days since, and that news cycle is continuing. The other thing I would say though is that the verdict was an opportunity for the international community, international media to again pay attention to Bangladesh, to return to Bangladesh for basically an update on the story from the July Revolution. So there was a lot of commentary. There was a lot of discussion on media channels around the world, not surprisingly, particularly in India, which has obviously a great deal of interest in what's happening in Bangladesh. But for me, it was interesting because on the one hand, there's the reactions of the normal kind of suspects in the media and the establishment who I think use their usual kind of hyperbole to try to generate clicks and views, etc. But at least I found that the reaction from the Indian government was a lot more measured than I had anticipated. And if you look at it over a kind of a longer period, I think there have been several signs that the Indian government is hedging its bets a little bit. And if I were Hasina or her supporters, I probably would have been disappointed with whether it was the reaction from the MEA, the reactions from the government, just even in terms of symbolism. For example, the fact that Bangladesh's national security advisor visited New Delhi within days of the verdict, and by all accounts had productive discussions there. So I think it was significant in terms of giving an indication of how some of the regional kind of approach from India might be shifting.
No, that's absolutely true. I too was struck by the measured nature of the response from the MEA in India. And as you said, that was followed very quickly by the meeting between Khalilur Rahman and Ajit Doval, the respective national security advisors of both countries, which by all accounts was very cordial. And I think my understanding, my sources tell me that they have really come to an agreement in that India has accepted the current state of affairs that we have in Bangladesh. They have accepted the elections will happen in February. They have accepted that the elections will happen without the Awami League. And ultimately, they have accepted our government's position, the Bangladesh government's position, that the reason the Awami League has been left out of the election is largely to do with the conduct of Sheikh Hasina and her government. And they accept that argument. And I think what they're looking for, they're looking towards the future. They have made it very clear over the past year that they are not comfortable with the interim government we have in place. So they've been pushing for elections, or we're going to have elections. We will have an elected government in place in Bangladesh within very short order. And so they're looking forward to more normalization, to doing business with an elected government. And I think also they feel that the Awami League will play an important part in the future of Bangladesh, but they are open to the notion that that does not necessarily mean Sheikh Hasina and her family. And they're looking forward to a future of the Awami League, which is the idea being that the Awami League still has many adherents, many voters. It represents a significant chunk of the Bangladeshi electorate, and those people, deserve a choice. But the party then needs to be separated out from the leadership of the party, which is extremely compromised and will continue to be compromised in light not only of the atrocities which were committed last summer during the uprising, but indeed over the last 15 years.
Right. And it's obviously been a difficult couple of weeks for Sheikh Hasina and her family and their supporters. Not only did you have the verdict in the ICT case, there was the verdict in the anti-corruption case involving the plot allocations and Purbochal. There was the discovery of Al Capone's vault, or Sheikh Hasina's vault in the bank, and the jewels and gold that were found. So again, I've seen various explanations for why these valuable items were sitting in a safe deposit box. I've read the defense put forward by members of her family about the plot allocations. But again, taken as a whole, that's the other side of this. On the one hand, there's the brutality, but then there was the overall sense of abuse of power, abuse of position, the nepotism, the corruption that characterized the regime. So I'm not sure from a marketing standpoint, this is exactly the message that you want to send to people. So, again, it's kind of a tale of two cities, as it were. You have, a bad week or bad couple of weeks for Sheikh Hasina, her family, and her party. And then you have, the elections coming up, which presumably will bring the BNP and Zia Rahman's family back to power. But on that side, that obvious positive trajectory has been interrupted by what I understand are some very serious reports about Begum Zia's failing health.
This is something, of course, everyone was talking about in Bangladesh for the last 24 hours. We were hearing reports of this, and it had been a subject of considerable concern and speculation. The latest reports I am hearing from informed sources on the ground is that she has stabilized and improved a bit overnight. So, for what it's worth, and of course, she has suffered severe ill health over the last several years and has always been able to bounce back. She's obviously a very resilient person, so one can hope that this is a similar incident, though of course it's perhaps too early to say for sure.
Right. And, it was interesting to see that when the BNP announced their presumptive or prospective list of candidates for parliament, Begum Zia was identified as being the candidate in 3 constituencies.
Correct. Yeah.
I guess. She did make an appearance at Armed Forces Day where she received very much the hero's welcome and, was greeted warmly by the military brass, civil society, political leaders, etc. So in one way, her profile had been higher than normal recently. I don't know if this may have taken something out of her, which then led to this setback. But the other curious issue which this raises, again, is the issue of Tariq Rahman's eventual return to Bangladesh. I saw a statement he put out, and, I understand that this is a deeply personal issue for him and his family as they look at Begum Zia's health. But if you're a public figure, you don't, I don't think, get to hide behind the private citizens' protections, as it were. While it might be prying for you or I to talk about each other's family and health issues, if you want to be the next prime minister of Bangladesh and you're preparing for an election campaign, I think it's only natural that people will ask these tough questions about not just the transition within the party and the leadership, the relationship between Begum Zia and Tariq, but again, the question that's lingered out there for months is, why has he not yet returned to Bangladesh?
Yeah, and I mean, as you say, this is a question which predates Begum Zia's recent return to the hospital. And it's something which, everyone has speculated about. And we haven't really received any good answers or any answers really from the BNP camp as to why this is the case. It's possible that there are security concerns, but at the end of the day, at some point, security concerns will always be there for public figures. And at some point, you really have to take the bull by the horns and say, I am going to, whatever security concerns there are today will not be any different in December. They will not be any different in January. They probably weren't any different 6 months ago. So I don't know if that is a legitimate reason to hold back. The security concerns will remain, and that's something we're just going to have to deal with. It is possible. One theory I have heard is that they're trying to, that in this day and age of social media, of the very short news cycle, the fear is that if he comes too early, it kind of jumps the gun in terms of the momentum which will be created. And then the idea would be you hold off as long as you can, and you ride that wave all the way to the election. When he comes back, there's a huge party to greet him at the airport. Then he goes on a 2-month tour of the country, and you really kind of ride that wave. And if you do it too soon or too early, it will dissipate. I mean, I'm not sure. That's one theory making around. What do you think?
Yeah, that's I've heard that a lot from people too, and there may be a certain electoral calculus that in which that makes sense. But for me, when it comes down to candidates and elections and then governing, so much is based on public perceptions and public trust. And you have to have I think, a good gut in terms of being a politician and in terms of sensing what that mood is. So my disadvantage is I'm not there on the ground in Bangladesh, whether it be in Dhaka or elsewhere. But I can only imagine that, people are eager to get to know Tariq Rahman more than through, a video screen or more than through, a Zoom call, that they want to reach out and touch him. They want to interact with him directly. He could end up coming back to Bangladesh at a very difficult time. Again, if Begum Zia's health doesn't improve, I'm glad to hear there were some reports that she stabilized. But, for somebody of her age and with her, health conditions, the long-term prognosis obviously is, very dicey. So it would seem to me that the sooner he can come back, the sooner that he can start building those relationships and building that trust, ultimately the better for him, not just for the campaign period, but for preparing to govern as well. And inevitably, when people think about Begum Zia and Tariq or Sheikh Hasina and her family, it's a hyphenated, right? It's about the two ladies, the battling Begums, -2. So many times in so many different ways, the formulation has always been, looking at one in the light of the other. And people are going to make those comparisons. So I think given some of the challenges that Tariq faces, this is an opportunity for him to reintroduce himself to the Bangladeshi people, to the international community. And as I say, you only get that, one chance to make a first impression. So I hope that he and his advisors are really thinking through their options and what is best, not just for him as a political candidate, but for him as a son, as a member of a family, and for him as a prospective, prime minister of, the 8th largest country in the world.
Exactly, and I think another crucial element of this is that, there are questions as to what the extent of his control over the party is. And I think it is very important that if he comes back, one of the things he can do is it will really cement his control over the party, which is necessary because, of course, party discipline is important. We hear a lot of reports of, BNP operatives involved in petty corruption, involved in extortion, and then the idea being that if he's here, that's something he can really deal with. It's been dealt with to some extent over the last year, but obviously it's something which he could really do more of when he's here in Bangladesh, and he really needs to be able to do that because, of course, a big part of his being able to govern effectively has to do with the discipline and control he has over the rank and file of his political party. As you say, he needs to, of course, reintroduce himself to the Bangladeshi people, and that's very important, reintroduce himself to the international community, but also I think it's very important that he needs to reintroduce himself in a different context to his own political party, because his political party, at the end of the day, is going to be the apparatus through which he exercises governance, he exercises his authority over the country. The two things cannot exist in isolation. I think also there is a big, what's the word, symbolic benefit to see, again, for people in the party, even people in the country, to see that, to see the things passed from Khalida Zia to him, because she remains, she's a two-time prime minister, so 2 times, yes, and remains very well respected across the political spectrum, I would say, in the country as a whole. So people seeing her sort of pass the baton over to Tariq in that process being undergone in public, I think would be helpful, both to him and for the country as a whole.
Right. Well, I know that both you and I are sports fans, and for me, I can think about this in a couple ways. Whether it's Tariq Rahman as a player or as a coach or a general manager, it's one thing. It's one thing when you are evaluating talent at practices or at tryouts. Somebody might, be the fastest, 40-yard dash, or might be able to lift the greatest amount of weight, and they look great on paper. But you have to actually watch them in game conditions to really judge, particularly in a team sport, because you can't just look at people individually. You have to look at how they work together as a team. So Tariq Rahman as a player has been, in the practice field. Now he needs to come back and get on the main field and play the game. But I think even more importantly, if he's the coach or the general manager and he's evaluating talent, he has to see his people as they're working, interacting with others, on the ground. So it's very different than the Zoom calls or the Zoom interviews he may have had with people, or even those who have made the pilgrimage to London and have sat with him in a drawing room and had a cup of tea and had a discussion and talked about, their philosophies, talked about their approach to politics and governing. I would think that as somebody who's putting together or thinking about putting together a team, he would want to see those people in action. And as he moves around the country, which presumably he'll do, he'll see his leaders from different parts of the country interacting there. He'll see people working together in groups, and then he may make some decisions which otherwise he wouldn't have. And, there's going to be no shortage of challenges that face the next government. I'm not pre-declaring that the BNP is going to win the election. It's a foregone conclusion. Tariq is going to become prime minister, but I think that's what most people would anticipate. But at a minimum, if that's what he aspires to, then he needs to prepare to put his team on the field, play the game in an environment which is going to be very challenging.
Yeah, and I think it's not helped by the fact that over the past few months we have had a number of reports that he's coming. He was going to come in November. Now, then we now hear, well, it's going to be the first week of December. The latest date I'm hearing is December 15th. I don't think that process of that lack of clarity, that lack of transparency in just having things continually kicked down the line really does much to engender confidence among the general rank and file. And I think there's also a sense that, you get a sense that this is too much like politics as usual in there. We're not being told things. And people want him here. And one of the things we had hoped in terms of sort of the BNP 2.0, you could say, or in Bangladeshi politics 2.0, is that the people are more sovereign than they have been in the past. And really, people would be our elected officials, our politicians would be far more sensitive to public opinion and what the public wants to see, rather than, look, I'm going to come when I want to come. So there's a little bit of a sense of that, things, it seems kind of like an old school way of conducting oneself. It seems like kind of an old school way of communicating with the general public, which is also, I think, part of the problem. It would have been a great way, really, to signal that there was change, that things had changed. And I think specifically for the BNP, I've said this before, and getting back to your issue as to who's going to win the election, it's an interesting question. I think this is a change election, okay? I think it's very clear that the Bangladeshi electorate are looking for something different. They're looking for change. They had the Awami League in power for 15 years. The Jamaat and the NCP's argument vis-a-vis BNP is that the BNP is not changed, that the BNP and the Awami League are two sides of the same coin, that they are the parties who have ruled Bangladesh for the last 52 years. And if you really want change, you're not going to get it through the BNP. And that is the message which is coming from the other two parties. The mantle of change, I would have thought, one would have thought, would have been something that the NCP could have donned, because of course they're the young party, they're the new party, they're the party which is the lead in the removal, the ouster of Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League a year and a bit ago. But they have not really been able to capitalize on that for a number of reasons. And interestingly enough, Jamaat has done a very good job of portraying itself as the change party. They're the ones who are saying, well, look, if you want change, you have us. And this is a party which predates, forget about predates Bangladesh, it predates Pakistan. But they have been able to, I think, successfully capture that sense. And you see this in the opinion polls, where they're very popular with younger voters in the ages 18 to 24. So to the extent that the BNP is going to be successful in this election, I think it has to also present itself as a change agent. They have to say, look, yes, the BNP of 2001 to 2006, we made mistakes. And yes, we are an old political party. And yes, we are part of the ruling duopoly that has run Bangladesh for these last 50 years, one way or another. But this is 2025, this is 2026. We are now a new party, and the face of this newness is Tariq Rahman, and the face of this newness, the evidence of this newness is how we're doing business. And if they conduct themselves in that way, I think that's really the goal for them. And so I think that being the case, it's very important, because right now, I think what they're fighting against is the public perception that the BNP today is the BNP that it's always been.
Right. And you would also think that if the parties themselves were interested in change, that change would begin at home. So I would throw Jamaat into this as well. Talking with some friends in Jamaat, there's also some frustration from people within Jamaat as well, that while the public image has changed, internally within the party, a lot of the structures haven't changed. That some of the more progressive voices within the party have been frustrated in their inability to get the party to move on key issues which they think would resonate with the voters. And then within both the major parties, again, my BNP friends will hate my lumping them together with the Awami League, but in neither party do you see a willingness and ability for people to openly challenge the narrative. So certainly with the Awami League post verdict, whether it be in the ICT case or these corruption cases, we've yet to see any significant break from Awami League leaders, whether those in Bangladesh, those in exile, distancing themselves from Hasina and her family. They have remained in lockstep. And within the BNP, again, there's been very little public criticism, very little public debate over these internal party matters, even though, again, both you and I'm sure, have had many private conversations with people from whether it be the BNP or the Awami League, in which people continue to express frustration about the leadership's lack of responsiveness to voices from within the party that call for some change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's really it. I mean, if we want to see change in Bangladesh, I think we all know what that change is going to look like. The change is going to look like people having the courage and the freedom to challenge their party leaders. It looks like the newspapers being free to criticize policies taken in a really try and hold the powers that be to account. And we've talked about reform, and of course there's been this huge reform discourse over the last year and a half, the last 15, 16 months in Bangladesh, and now it's culminated in the July Charter, it's culminated in the referendum, which is a little bit confusing, but it's all there. But it seems to me that at the end of the day, the real reform we need is the one we have been talking about. And then stepping back even further, fundamentally what we actually need then is a reform of the way, people like myself, Bangladeshis, actually think and feel. So ultimately it's up to us to demand these of our political leaders, to demand these of the powers that be. And I think if we continue to do that, that we will get that reform which we're looking for. So far, there have been half steps and half measures, and we were just talking about that. But hopefully, in this election season, we will see more responsiveness. It's going to be very interesting, and that's of course the final reason why we want to see Tariq back here in Bangladesh. It's kind of like this, this sort of waiting for Godot type situation. Everyone is waiting for the other shoe to drop. Nothing really happens until he gets here. We're kind of in a holding pattern, as far as I see. And I think that's it's important to really sort of move on to the next phase of our political evolution. It's very important now that he comes here, that until he gets here, we're kind of all just treading water.
Yeah, I think that that's clearly the case. And once he arrives and once that next phase starts, my sense is it'll be pretty fast and furious. So I've been resting up over these last few days. I hope you've had a chance to take a break as well, because it looks like over the next couple of months, it'll be coming at us all pretty fast.
I think so. And on that note, thank you, John. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in. This has been Zafar Saban and John Danilowitz, the Jay-Z Show.